transition periods are always difficult, but it's been particularly difficult this time around with so many, different adoption dates and transitional periods and pushing out and just states doing all different kinds of things. And even within the code, you have state variations to construction methodology. So it's just, you just got to hone down, you work project by project and just keep up with what the industry is putting out in terms of professional development. But yeah, look, even just the way that the code is structured and learning to read, you have to almost learn to reread it again.
Well, Laura, it is so awesome to have you here at the Undercover Architect podcast. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you because I know what we're going to be talking about is an area that can be confusing for industry professionals, let alone homeowners sort of navigating it. It's very terminology heavy. And of course, the updates to the National Construction Code for 2022 have brought another layer of, I suppose, understanding that's required in terms of how we potentially navigate the approval process for our projects. Before I dive into that, though, I'd just love for you to tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing now and set up Deem to Perform.
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks so much for having me too. It's a real pleasure to be invited to have the chat, and I'm looking forward to being able to dive into what I'm passionate about and share it with your audience as well. So look, I started as an architectural drafter. That's what I started in the industry as, and happened to find my way into modular housing. So I think that's the point where I really became interested in other ways of building and, innovative building techniques and materials and just doing things a little bit differently. And that also put me on the path to building surveying, right? So moving from drafting into product specification, compliance management, a bit of project management too, and then actually finding that building surveying and regulatory matters, particularly, with building products and modular housing, it was quite a different way of dealing with being able to build here in Australia. So that sort of put me on the path of building surveying, and then went into, getting into Victorian regulations and becoming an RBS, so a relative building surveyor. Sorry, I'll apologise in advance for any acronyms and Victorian-based terminology I might use, but yeah, so a building surveyor. And then setting up my own business, which really is focused on helping designers, homeowners, builders be able to navigate through complex regulatory systems. I found that there was a real gap in where being able to act as a building surveyor or a building certifier to be able to assist, because you're governed by legislation and you're an authority, so you can't get involved with design. You really have to have that distance. So there's a lot of gaps in being able to assist other project parties in navigating through that system. So working as a consultant building surveyor, you really have a lot more flexibility in being able to assist with the design and be involved early on in the project. And that's, where I'm passionate, and performance-based designs as well. Having that modular background, and it really sort of led me to that path there. So that's sort of how I got to where I am today. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Finding ways to do things outside of our very restrictive building codes with the Deem to Satisfy. It's been a really great opportunity to do that.
Fantastic. Well, there's lots there that you've mentioned in that answer that I know will have pricked homeowners' ears in terms of, oh gosh, that what does that mean, and what does that mean? So I'm really looking forward to, because even in talking about building certification, there's a lot of terminology rich kind of language and that kind of stuff. So I'm looking forward to diving into and unpacking some of those terms and what they actually mean and how they impact the approval process for a homeowner. Can you just explain a little bit more about what a building surveyor, who, as you said, is also known as a building certifier in other states? Victoria's pretty is typically known as a building surveyor. What do they actually do, and when do they get involved in a renovation or new build? And when do you sort of recommend homeowners sort of consider this professional in their team as well? How does that sort of process work?
Yeah, so I think it's also really important to make a distinction between a consulting building surveyor and a statutory building surveyor. So generally for residential projects, if you've been involved with them in the past, you'll have known, you most likely dealt with a statutory building surveyor or building certifier. So that's the person involved with getting your building permit prior to the commencement of construction. So their role is to do regulatory assessments, act as a regulatory authority, do a building permit once they're satisfied compliance is met from a design point of view, issue a building permit, and then conduct mandatory inspections through the construction phase. So there are regulated inspection points, and then issuing a certificate of final inspection or occupancy permit, depending on what type of project it is and what it requires. A consulting building surveyor is someone like myself who has the building surveying background and qualifications, but they can act in areas, so they're not appointed from a statutory point of view. You engage them similar as you would a designer, and they can advise you on design matters, regulation through the whole process, and act on your behalf, and just have that knowledge of a building surveyor and advise on regulatory matters, but then also give design advice. So generally, a statutory building surveyor, you would get involved once your design is quite developed. They will want a minimum amount of information before they can review and process your building permit. So you're going to need to have a degree of structural engineering completed, architectural design for them to get involved. Consulting building surveyor, I mean, the earlier you can get someone involved, the better. You don't have to have a consultant building surveyor. It really depends on the complexity of the project, and whether you feel and your design team feel it's necessary, because you may be doing something that's a little bit out of the ordinary. You may be considering performance, and getting someone earlier involved so that they can do some preliminary assessments for you, set out some design options for you. I mean, I'm a big proponent of early intervention is the best. There, you know, when it's on pen and paper, it's much easier to deal with preliminary designs. It's always easier to do it earlier on than sort of leaving it to, you know, once you're quite developed and then you've submitted something to a statutory building surveyor certifier, and then you've got to rewind quite a lot of design and quite a lot of participants in that process to be able to get the design outcome that you want. So yeah, there's, you know, just making that distinction. More often than not, like I said, you will have dealt with the statutory building survey and residential projects more often, and yeah, they'll do that full building permit, inspections, and then occupancy permit at the end of it.
Gotcha. No, that's a great run through. And I think, I don't think in every state that you necessarily have to have a separate person doing the consultative process compared to the actual statutory approval process. From my previous experience in Queensland, the same certifier could do both, but I know that in New South Wales, it's the same thing. You can't have somebody who's consulting to you during the design phase also providing the statutory review. And it's going to be interesting to see, I think, in terms of there being some cleanliness. I mean, the whole reason that would have been brought in as two separate roles is to make sure that you're not basically, that you've got those important checks and measures to ensure that it's actually meeting building code and that people aren't sort of moving through loopholes. And I think, you know, obviously councils used to be the ones that provided the statutory certification, you know, a couple of, you know, decades ago. So I'm showing my age, but I remember when councils used to be who we'd go to get the statutory approval done and get that assessment done. And since that's been privatized, obviously there's these checks and balances that come in terms of who does what and how it gets siloed. So it's really interesting to hear. I mean, at Undercover Architect, we're all about the importance of creating a collaborative team from the start to get that input. Because as you say, whilst it's lines on a page, it's so much easier to change before you've fallen in love with it. You've invested all this money and time in creating it to then find out that it's not going to achieve the approvals, or that it's going to be super expensive to achieve the approvals because you need to jump through a bunch of hoops in order to make that happen. So
just on the point of the consultant and the statutory, and in Victoria it's very, very heavily regulated. So it's regulated in our acts and regulations, and also our building authority have a code of conduct. So that has really made the distinction quite clear. And now I can't speak to the other states in terms of appointment of statutory building surveyors. In Victoria, once you actually engage a statutory building surveyor, you're locked in quite heavily with them. You can't shop around for because they're a regulatory. So once you appoint, if something were to arise where you no longer are able to work with your building surveyor, it actually needs to go through the building authority to break that relationship. So it's just something to bear in mind. It's not, once you do appoint your building surveyor, it's that's not for the consultant building surveyor. It's that statutory body that you need to be mindful that, you know, even if it's a bit of a relationship issue that you have with them, they are obliged to continue carrying out their statutory functions. Again, I'm not too sure about the other states, but that's how the appointment works in Victoria.
Oh, that's great information, because I know I can imagine that's come up because of developers sort of going, no, let's just fire him and find somebody who will approve.
Don't like
this.
that interpretation, move on. No. And it's there to protect the consumer ultimately. The statutory building surveyor has an obligation for building safety, consumer safety, you know, not just the current owners, but future owners. So yeah, it's something that's pretty stringently regulated.
Fantastic. Now, I'd really love to dive into the National Construction Code 2022 and the changes that have been made, because it's a big update for everyone involved. And of course, Victoria's just pushed back its adoption of it till for another 6 months. So that's, you know, I know that it's still a bit of a moving feast, particularly in Victoria. States have varied in terms of how they are adopting it and what parts of it they're adopting. But I find that everybody who's had this on their radar has been doing a lot of upskilling because they know that it's coming at some point and that they need to be ready for it and understand it. As somebody, you know, as a professional who actually has to assist and guide people to understand the design and construction according to these new and updated regulations, and you're also, you know, helping to advise architects and builders and things like that about what they need to know about it, what are some of the challenges that you've seen professionals dealing with, or that you've been kind of contending with yourself in terms of wrapping your head around the changes generally to the National Construction Code?
Yeah. So, I mean, initially it's just been the struggle of the changing dates. I mean, you know, you were given about a year lead up to, you know, 2022, and then it got pushed, and even in Victoria now we don't have full adoption, so we've pushed until May. The condensation, livable housing and energy efficiency, but the rest of it is applying. And I know some states aren't adopting it in full. So it's really been hard to set a date in your mind to say, okay, this is where I really need to wrap my head around. So for me, like, the energy efficiency stuff is the biggest change, the way we're looking at whole of home. It's just, once you've got a mental point to date to work to, it's a lot easier to say, hey, you know, like, I've got all, you know. And I mean, the authorities have been great and the Institute of Building Surveying too has set out a lot of professional development, but it's not until you have that set date where you really have to start implementing it that it becomes practice for everyone, the building surveyors, design practitioners, to get used to using it. The reference
and the clients as well, for them to know, okay, where is the drop dead date that I need to try and push towards if I'm going to be doing this, or I have to adopt all of the changes because I'm going to be the other side of it as well. That's been really challenging.
And in Victoria, we have what's called Section 10. So if you've done considerable design prior to, say, 1st of October when we started, then you can apply to your building surveyor to say, no, the previous code applied, and you have to show substantial design work. So even then, you've got applications coming in that after the adoption date, but you're still working through, you know, 2019 Amendment 1, and then it's just a bit. Transition periods are always difficult, but it's been particularly difficult this time around with so many, you know, different adoption dates and transitional periods and pushing out, and just states doing all different kinds of things. And even within the code, you have state variations to construction methodology. So it's just you just got to hone down. You work project by project, and just keep up with what the industry is putting out in terms of professional development. But yeah, look, even just the way that the code is structured and learning to read, you have to almost learn to reread it again. So this is volume 2. Volume 1 hasn't changed too much. Volume 2, which is for domestic buildings, is considerably different. So you've gone from really using one book plus the reference standards to 3 books plus all the reference standard, and getting used to, you know, I think probably until 2025 I'll still be using all the old 2019 BCA clauses, because in the new version there's a lot of more letters and numbers, but you know, it's just it's working through it and getting used to it. I mean, no one tends to like change, and it's the changes that have come into place, that it's a slow move in the right direction. It feels like it's probably a lot bigger than what it is, but yeah, it's a case of getting used to it a lot of the time.
It's really interesting to see when you actually go online that they've got still all of the NCC 2019 clause numbers down the right-hand side as you're navigating the NCC 2022 clause numbers, so that you can sort of be making that cross-reference in your brain. And I was chatting to a Queensland based certifier who had the PDF on his screen, and he actually just used the PDF search to find, because it said NC 2022 update. So he was basically using the find tool inside the PDF to then go through and see where all the clauses had been updated.
That's exactly what I've been doing.
Yeah, in brackets afterwards. So yeah.
I mean, it's great that they did that. I mean, I think the challenge of moving to this new referencing system would have been twice the effort if I was, mentally just trying to work through, is that the same as the previous? Now you can almost do or what has changed with this code, and Control F is a fantastic function with online tools.
Now, as part of the approval process, there's some definitions that you touched on. I really love to help the Undercover Architect community understand more about these. And so the structure of the NCC 2022, it lays out every clause as the functional statement, then the performance requirements, then it has the verification methods, and then it has the deemed to satisfy provisions. And then we have those reference documents, as you touched on. We've got the housing regulations, the livable housing guidelines. So what does this all generally mean with the NCC 2022, and how do we navigate it? How do we understand what these headings mean, and how do they sort of relate then to how we seek our approvals and understand what we actually have to do from a regulatory point of view for our projects?
Yeah, so always it seems to be an area that I think we skim over in the building code is actually the governing requirements. So that's section A, because that actually sets out how to read the code. And when you have a look at that, you'll see that the only mandatory provisions are the governing requirements and the performance provisions. So I think that's a really important point to understand, because often we start at, say, the deemed to satisfy and then work our way down. So it's probably the most boring part of the code, but it's probably one of the most important ones to actually understand the structure and how to read it. So following that, the functional statement is essentially your guidance as to how the building is going to achieve the objectives of that particular part of the BCA. So it's a non-mandatory requirement, it's more guidance. Same with the objectives, it's really just setting out what the intent is of that particular part of the code in achieving compliance. Following that, you'd see the performance provisions, which is alongside the governing provisions, the only mandatory part of the building code. So what it does is it actually sets out the level of performance that either a performance solution or a deemed to satisfy solution need to meet. And that's the level. So you've got governing requirements, to ensure that you're reading and following the structure of the BCA correctly. And then your performance provisions, that's the level of performance that the building needs to achieve in a certain area. Now, the next level is you'd see the verification methods. They're essentially a test, inspection, calculation, or other way of determining that a performance solution complies with the performance provisions. So the BCA has a set of verification methods that can be used, and you might, some of your listeners may be aware of the energy efficiency, where a reference building is used. That's quite a common one for domestic buildings, but it just needs to be, you need to be aware that that verification method is an assessment method of a performance solution. So it's a structured way for you to be able to demonstrate compliance to performance provisions. Different from a deemed to satisfy. It's when you go through, say, a performance solution, which I know we're going to speak about in a little bit more depth later on, it's a way for you to actually, in a formalized method, be able to demonstrate compliance for a performance provision, not a deemed to satisfy.
Yeah, and it makes sense, doesn't it? Because that, previously, I think I know in the past, those performance solutions have often been quite subjective from the point of view of the assessing or the regulatory, the statutory certifier. And it really sort of came down to a negotiation of, was this solution that we were designing going to achieve the intent that was laid out in those functional requirements? And then they're basically then making their own assessment. And that was always open to interpretation. And you'd find, I mean, I remember we'd be like, well, let's go with that certifier for this job because we know that they're a little bit more lenient on this. Let's go for this certifier on this job because, and so, and obviously, that's probably gone to the extreme in terms of how some less than scrupulous operators have navigated those performance solutions to meet the functional requirements. So the verification methods is actually a really interesting one to see so well laid out now in the code, and to be so explicit in terms of, okay, you're not going to, if you can't do this in terms of the deemed to satisfy, then this is how we need you to do this version. And you need to then demonstrate how you're going to meet.
Unfortunately, though, it's still discretionary. Now, the performance provisions they're quite qualitative in that they don't have real very defined parameters around, how you demonstrate compliance. So a verification method is a useful tool, but it's also not a mandatory one. So you can still do say a performance solution for energy efficiency without having to do the verification method. For all parties involved, it is great though to have the structure there if it is the most suitable way of for you to be able to demonstrate compliance for each particular matter. And not all performance solutions have an option for verification. The code also allows verification methods that are not within the code, not within the building code, but accepted by the relevant authority. So ultimately, all performance solutions are at the discretion of the relevant building surveyor. And most of the performance provisions you'll find are qualitative, subjective to a degree, which, unfortunately, it's just one of those things that I don't think will change, because you've got the prescribed, or you've got the very restrictive requirements under the deemed to satisfy, which is your recipe book type checklist. Okay, you're deemed to comply with the performance provisions. But it is, from a performance solution point of view, it's always a struggle that the industry is having with, well, what is acceptable, and which is the introduction of the performance-based design brief. Part of the intent of that is to better the situation, improve the situation in documenting design decisions and actually going through that process of testing and trialing and putting pen to paper as to how whoever's prepared the performance solution got to that end result and how it can justify it.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, before we dive into those performance solutions and the performance-based design briefs, can you just touch on the reference documents in terms of how they sort of sleeve into all of this? Because they're obviously a new addition in terms of the structure as well.
Yeah. So the new NCC, the way that it's structured is you've got section A, which is, that's standard from the previous version as well, which is your governing requirements. In volume 2, you've then got section H, which is essentially your, I think of it as the table of contents. So your overarching umbrella as to where do I go to demonstrate compliance. So then under section H, you have your objectives, your functional statements, your performance provisions, and then the deemed to satisfy. So in this new structure, the section H deemed to satisfy, we used to call them acceptable construction manuals or acceptable construction practice. It's essentially the acceptable construction manual. So it's telling you, okay, well, these are your options. You can either go to the reference documents, which is the housing provisions. You can go to one of the Australian standards, or you can go to, the Australian Building Codes Board's standard documentation. So it sets out that tree of where you need to go, depending on certain parameters, exemptions, and where you can use certain. So the housing provisions, say for slabs, you may not be able to use them in all scenarios because it's dictated by the size of the slab, the soil conditions. So then if you can't meet that, then you need to go to an Australian standard, or, there are other pathways. So that's that section H, sets out the pathway of how to demonstrate compliance, whether it's, your performance provisions or then you're deemed to satisfy. So then following that, you've got, so after section 8, you then got all your schedules, which will be your definitions, and then the reference documents, and also your state-based, because each state's then going to have a variation on how they adopt those parts of the code. Then we follow through to the next book, which is the housing provisions, then the livable housing, and then the energy efficiency requirements. So you're then branching out from there, and then that's separate to the Australian standards. And then below that, we have some more state variations. So there's actually 2 sections of state variations. So there's a bit of a process that you need to go through to actually work your way through the compliance tree, umbrella, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, a tree is actually a really great way to think of it. It's not for the faint-hearted, is it? But it's it's one of those things where I had a certifier sort of take us through, showing us, okay, well, if this is the situation you're dealing with, or this is what you're thinking of doing from a design point of view, then this is where you go to do, like, you have to look at this, and then you have to look at this, because, and it was kind of like a yes, no sort of process as you move through the tree. And it was quite clear once you could understand that that's how you had to navigate it, but it's obviously different to what we've been used to in the past. Like, I can see the sequencing that they've strategized so that it works from an online point of view as well as a written, of course, these codes we used to have as printable books that used to sit beside our desk in the office. And, we had one guy that we worked with that we called the Oracle, because he seemed to have it all committed to memory. So, and so if we ever had any issues, it was like him that we'd go to say, hey, Robbie, where is this? What clause do I need to find? And he could just pull it out of his brain, but but for those of us that aren't mental, steel traps on these things, it is much more, I think once we get used to the new structure, it is going to be simpler to navigate and more intuitive to navigate. It's just so different to what we've been used to. And I think that understanding of, okay, this is what you're contending with. So yes, no, keeping moving down the line to see, okay, what does that then mean from the point of view of what process you then have to go through to get your approval.
And I think, being that most of us don't work on hard copy books anymore, I think it's complicated, the situation, whereas the previous code, you could just work your way through, and then if you needed to go to the separate standards, but now and when you don't have physical books in front of you, you probably, ideally you have 3 screens, and that's generally how I would work. If you have your plans on one screen, you have now I'll need, one for housing provisions, one for, section 8, and then the standards. So yeah, it's another way of just learning to work differently. There was obvious intent and structure as to why it was done. It's just, we get stuck in our ways sometimes, and how to deal with things. Maybe I need to go back to paper and then I can have my books there. And
oh gosh, it's just a lot, isn't it? So I can see why everybody's reeling about it, but it's so good to have you kind of unpack it for us and start to give clues and information for what people need to be aware of as they navigate it wherever they're located in Australia. I think that there's going to be commonalities of terminology, and it is a national construction code, so it's really going to be a case of at least understanding that there is this structure to it, what it means, and then how we sort of start to ask those questions of the team that we're working with.
Look, it's becoming more and more, because people are really understanding and having clients who are, who are really pushing for it. I mean, the demand is becoming greater, so governments need to get involved more in really trying to support those who are pushing sustainability and building resilience and all of those things, because it's such an important issue. But it's bringing up the whole industry, I think, is going to be really challenging, even though it's globally, I think we do fall short in our codes in keeping up with what's being done. But unfortunately, it just takes more people being a bit louder about it, and and then seeing like the completed projects, and who doesn't want to not have energy bill, like electricity and gas bills, and live in a home that's healthy to live in.